Hola amigos, today we are going to be talking about the present indicative and how to form questions in Spanish. Now, the present indicative is one of the first tenses that we ever learned, and um, it is the most simple as well. Um, it basically in English is something like I run or I talk. Um, Anything that is happening in the present tense. Now, the conjugation for verbs in the present indicative is for yo, you put an o at the end. For tu, you put an as or an s at the end, depending on whether it is ar or er or ir. Um, for el, ella, usted, you put an a or an e at the end, depending again whether it's ar, er, or ir. Um, for nosotros, we put an amos or an hemos. For vosotros, we put a ais or ace or is. So if it's ar, you would put ais. If it's er, you would put ace, and if it's ir, you'd put is. And ellos, ellas, o ustedes is on or en. So, for example, for the verb hablar, if I wanted to say I talk, I would say hablo. If I wanted to say you talk, I would say hablas. If I wanted to say he talks, I would say habla. If I wanted to say we talk, I would say hablamos. If I wanted to say you guys talk, I would say habláis. If I wanted to say they talk, I'd say hablan. So some of the details is that the subject always goes before the verb, um, especially when you're not asking a question, which will be explained later. Um, you should also not have any conjugated verbs that are back to back. For example, if I wanted to say I want to talk, I would say quiero hablar instead of quiero hablo or something. Um, and some examples is no hablo español, I don't speak Spanish, or estudiamos juntos, we study together. The stem changers are things that happen to the stem of the verb, which is the first part instead of the ending that can be changed depending on the subject. There are usually three different uh, stem changes that could occur um, in general. There is e to I, like pensar becomes piensa when it is conjugated. There's O to UE, like encontrar becomes encuentras when it is conjugated, and E to I. This only usually happens for IR verbs, so servir becomes sirvo. Um, Now, the stems of words can only change um, for the conjugations within this boot. We call it the boot because uh, when you put it in a conjugation chart like this, it kind of looks like a boot around it. So you can see that the nosotros and the vosotros both do not have stem changers. As you can see with dormir, here the O stays as an O, and here it changes to a UE. Yogo verbs are another type of verb that are interesting because when it is the first person singular, like I put, um, some verbs add a G to the beginning of the ending um, because that's just how they are. So I put because becomes pongo instead of pono, which would be what it would be if it was without the G. So There are some irregular verbs. These are only four of them. There are still more, but these are the most used. Ser becomes soy, eres, es, somos, soy, son. Estar becomes estoy, estás, estamos, estáis, está, están. Uh, Ir becomes voy, vas, va, vamos, vais, van. Uh, and haber becomes has, a, or I. Hemos, habéis, han. So with that being said, is how questions can be formed.
Um, Forming questions in Spanish can be quite simple. Uh, Basically, there's a certain formula that you can use to make these questions. And although there is no one way to write a question in Spanish, this way I will explain is like the most common way to form a question. So first, a typical thing that you do is you open up the sentence with an opening phrase to start questions such as como, which can mean how, qual, which can mean what, and etc. And although this is not required to have these words to make it a question, it helps to frame what type of question you are trying to ask. Words like this, though, if you are going to use them, must be at the start of the sentence, of the question sentence that you're trying to make. After this step, whether you use one of these words or not, uh, if you are asking about certain action, then this is where you state the action here with a verb. You gotta make sure that the conjugated verb makes sense to how you ask the question. For example, if you're using the to form, if you are asking about the person themselves, like how are you doing, you would use to there, to conjugated verb there. Or if you're asking, or the ella form when asking a person about another person, like was this person doing? That's when you would use that. The conjugation is very important to not mess up. Otherwise, like the question will not make sense. This is a common mistake you could see when you make questions. And after this, you gotta be sure, if applicable, to state nouns after the verb to signify action being done towards them. And this would normally be the subject of your sentence. Finally, the words used after this point, after you stated your subject, are typically just additional information about the subject that is not really necessary for the question to make sense. It's more so to help ask a specific one, like details about your subject or where something is. And at the bottom, you can see these steps in like a little formula, like simple equation. It goes preposition, which is those question words like qual, como. Your question word, which is your verb that we talked about. Uh, Shoot, wait a second. Wait a second. So it's our preposition first, and then our question word that we talked about then. And then we have our conjugated verb that we talked about, followed by the subject, and then our additional information. Also, an important thing to do after you finish writing the question is to put question marks on both sides, with the first question mark being an upside down question mark. The text type on the next slide, I think, yeah, those are some more examples if you want to use those. But in the next slide after that is an example of where you would use these questions, like in an interview type style. As you can see in the bolded questions, they're like questions that you can ask or look at the basically how they create questions, and see like the different types that we haven't talked about. Or you could also like see examples of like the formula that we gave you. Yeah, so that's how that is one way you can create a question.